The next theory that I'm going to go into is that by Bourdieu. And Bourdieu, even though he talks about fields and therefore resembles basically Luhmann with his subcategorizations or subgroups within society, although Luhmann called them systems, Bourdieu is not a systems theorist at all. So his fields are not systems in that sense because they're not closed and they all merge into each other. Bourdieu is also the type of sociologist that Luhmann would disagree with because Bourdieu really fundamentally cares about agents and their agencies. And basically Bourdieu structures society, or thinks that society is made up of various fields. They can be small, they're big, and there are fields within fields within fields, so I guess they're also very semi-autonomous. So there can be the legal field, but within it more the human rights field, the international commercial arbitration field, the whatever marriage law field. So they're categorized, and even one law firm can be a field in that sense. A field's then just an area of structured, socially patterned activity or practice, which is usually defined either by profession or by discipline or whatnot. And because they are not closed and kind of merge into each other, fields exert a force upon all who come in its range, so almost like a magnet. And importantly, within fields, agents are struggling for the power of definition. This is more or less a Weberian approach, but not really, because Weber would argue that it's important how actors pursue and achieve relative control within a market structured by the state, but dominated by professional producers of services. So Weber sees he attributes a lot of relevance to the state, whereas Bourdieu doesn't really. So what's the main claim? The main claim of Bourdieu is that he focuses a little bit on the legal field or the judicial field, and he finds that the juridical field, so legal professionals, are a social field and therefore organized around a body of internal protocols and assumptions, characteristic behaviors, self-sustaining values, so almost like a professional culture. Importantly, to reiterate, he doesn't really attribute that much importance to the state. So the juridical field and the legal profession is not, in Bourdieu's theory, an instrument of the state, but it's its own relatively autonomous thing with its own complex and often antagonistic relations to state power. So within any field, there are different elements, according to Bourdieu. So he argues that agents are important because agents each have a habitus. And a habitus are internalized schemes that guide behavior, like a way of understanding or judging the world around us. It's more or less what humans are socialized to do. But fundamentally, every person's trajectory is different. So people who may be trained in law all were trained in different law schools. So they all have a different habitus, and they all come from different socioeconomic standings, which shape their habitus. They come from different, perhaps, ethnicities, which shape their background. But ultimately, sometimes you can group habitus into a category because they resemble each other a lot. So the thing is that habitus is really socialized subjectivity. For instance, socialized subjectivity. And they can affect our position within society. So let's say that So there's this example of law school's oral exams being conducted by men usually, and by old professors. So the candidate can say what they want, but what matters is their habitus. So how they can conform to an examiner's traditional expectations of what a successful candidate would look like. Hence, their experiences of how they should perform to do well may be different from what the examiner thinks a good candidate should do. So within a field, there are agents with habitus, and the field has orthodoxy. Orthodoxy are basically the beliefs which are announced as a requirement that everybody has to conform to in a field. For instance, that everybody in the legal field shouldn't commit a crime because that's just not good. And these kind of define a person's entry into the juridical field. Once they subscribe to that, the juridical field's orthodoxy, they can enter into it. So it's like the rules of the legal game that have to be adhered to. Other examples would be that decisions should never be gray but really black and white, or that precedent should be adhered to, and that there's this doctrine of stare decisis. So orthodoxy is more explicit, something that can be learned almost, whereas there's another thing called doxa. And doxa is that which appears self-evident so that nobody mentions or questions it anymore. There's not even the need for a norm because it's just literally done. It's taken for granted within that field. So, you can't really pin down these habitus, orthodoxy, doxa that much. But what you can pin down is a field capital, or the capital of agents within the field. Because capital refers not to just like Marxist capital, which has to be seized, or to money, but for instance to productive capacity, which an individual has accumulated, or symbolic capital, for example, whether somebody has one doctor title or another PhD, or prestige, knowledge, reputation, anything like that. And importantly, every field kind of has defined what capital it considers valuable. For instance, whether a MPhil or an MA or a Master of Science is more valuable in that field. And as I said before, the agents struggle over the power of definition. So they struggle to be on top, basically, and all try to get their own view of what should be valorized most, or how things should be valorized to be the dominant, almost doxa in the field. Importantly, this power of definition can be seen as symbolic violence. So those agents in a field with a lot of symbolic capital, who are seen as on top, basically, have the power to define reality. And therefore they can impose principles of division, like who's an insider, who's an outsider, where is the entry point, who gets to participate in the legal field. Like if you're just a legal clerk, you might be listening to all of the legal decisions, but you're not seen as being very reliable. You're not being seen as actually qualified to be in the legal field or in the juridical field. And the thing is that symbolic capital, or this power of definition of people who have a lot of symbolic capital, is symbolic violence because the recipients don't have a lot of choice whether to accept it or not. So this is because it is so structurally embedded that the world is transformed and defined because words to name reality are changed. There's categories through which everybody views the world. So this can't really, this can be questioned, and that is what is done through the struggles of agents. And this can lead to overall power relations coming to be perceived as legitimate by the subjects. And again, this is not like a bad process, it's just how society works, it's the structures. So for instance, in the juridical field, we can again look at how legal agents are in competition with other legal agents. For instance, those doing pro bono cases are viewed as on the bottom and not having a lot of symbolic capital, whereas those working in being partners in commercial law firms are seen as being on top of the hierarchy and have the power of definition. But even the juridical field doesn't just have agent struggles within it and have symbolic capital over other people in the juridical field, but because fields are fluid and there are fields within fields within fields, we can even talk about in society as a whole, the juridical field has moved on top over other fields. And legal language has come to be the language through which reality is perceived. Because linguistic processes are such powerful symbolic violence means or mechanisms. And the law's language is very neutralizing, it's very passive, it's very universalizing. And this kind of maintains the structures. And over time, as new legal categories emerge, we can see how agents who are not in the power, who don't have the power of definition, how they fight and struggle to have the power of definition and to have their own capital seen as valuable. We can even talk about like sociology, legal sociologists or legal anthropologists struggling to, within the field of academia to surpass law students or lawyers or legal experts and say like, hey, no, I know how this is ordered. So there are differences and struggles there. And finally, Bourdieu is really useful because he has this concept of reflexive sociology. He is useful to use as a methodology, and now we're not just talking about his concept of habitus and fields and doxa, but we're talking about how he really wanted people to study agents and not the whole legal system, because social reality doesn't just exist like that, but when you study it, you need to be really careful not to misconstrue it. So he wants any researcher to pay double attention, one, to the research tradition that they're using and where it comes from, and second, how they are applying this research tradition in their present